Okay, Prof, Associate Professor P.Thinavan from University of Tunku, Rahman, Malaysia.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us on this program. Now, we have been discussing many times before actually, and you've heard that many times we hear this, everybody is complaining that the country is going down the drain. People are saying that we are a failed state and so on and so forth. To summarize it, essentially for the past 4 years, maybe 10 years, and they're echoing, in every aspect of our society, every aspect of the country, we are failing. So obviously, when these people say we are failing, it obviously means that they want some change.
That's
so
right.
the question is, whenever we talk about change, what exactly do we mean change? My concern here is, Prof, that while people are complaining about wrong things in the country, the question is, you want to replace them with something else, which is change. So let's discuss about what is exactly change. What are the mechanisms of change? What's your view on this?
Okay, with regards to change, of course, everybody knows the famous saying that change is the only constant in life. And change is necessary because we want to improve from perhaps a reasonably good state to a better state, or from a reasonably bad state to an average state and beyond. But the important thing about the change is that the word change itself can be quite complex. Right? It's very complex. So when people talk about change, exactly what they mean, perhaps they are asking for change in specific areas. That needs to be identified. And it doesn't mean that a country is failing because there is no change, because change is always happening. Right? Change is always happening. So to make the change in a way that betters the society, for the betterment of society, we need to identify exactly what change that we need to initiate.
If I can interrupt you there for a while. Huh?
Yeah.
Now, when they say, for example, they say the country is a failed state, or failing, or declining. Now, declining itself must mean that originally it was in a better state than it was before.
Yes.
And as you correctly pointed out, that change is a constant factor, constant matter. In other words, whether you like it or not, every single second, every single day, there's a change going on. So you're talking about Malaysia was in a certain state, and now you're saying it's worse off. That means it's changed from the better situation to the worse situation. So in other words, that change itself is going on. But that is a kind of change that is not doing good for the country or for the community, for that matter. So don't you think that, I would think that we also need to identify what was it that was working before that we are no longer using it or applying it, and that's brought to a worse state, and what is it that we should do that we can improve our position now? You know what I'm saying? Now, why I'm asking about this understanding change is because if you remember Egypt, for instance, you had the Arab Spring, and they was hoping that with the removal of the despot, as they saw, and with the Arab Spring, Egypt would be better. But we all know they didn't get better at all. Now, similarly also with the annexation of course there was a political matter, annexation of Iraq, for instance, by the Americans. Now, there was change, but the change left the Iranians even worse, the Iraqis even worse off.
That's right.
So in that context, don't you think that before we can even go towards wanting change, we need to understand that what kind of change that we want? What's your take on that?
Okay. From the basic point of view, from the fundamental point of view, all human beings want to aspire to achieve certain goals and objectives. This desire is there, but somehow there's always a gap. There's always a gap between what you want and what is actually happening on the ground. And this is largely due to processes which are not in place. Number one. Number two, the changes that we want sometimes is for the sake of change. And there's no essence to it, there's no roots to it.
There was something new for the sake of it being new.
Exactly. Just perhaps it could be a follow me kind of culture. Since there's an Arab Spring there, then we should create one. But as you rightly pointed out, change doesn't always happen. Change always doesn't result in a better life or in a more improved state of affairs. unless of course the change that you want to create is properly thought out, meaning you need to chart exactly what you want the change to be.
Okay.
In order to fill up the gap between what is current and what you want to happen. So that gap is a big gap actually, because to fill that gap, even in social sciences, changing simple human behavior like to drive safely on the road, it has taken years and years. After so much of campaigns and education, we are still failing because most number of deaths happen always on the road.
Okay. Let's say for example, since you mentioned that whenever we speak about change, for a proper change to take place or to understand the mechanics of change, we need to look at the specifics. Let's say we in this our discussion, let's say we try to identify one specific change that people in this country want. There are a lot of complaints.
That's right.
Now, what comes to your head? One, that people say we want to change in this country. What change do you think they want in this country?
Perhaps they want to change
In governance?
In governance.
Okay. Let's say, for example, we take this, people are saying we want to change in governance. And I suppose we can guess that most of them want a good government.
That's
right. Don't you think that if society, for instance, and we know that it is not society that is going to bring about the change proper. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's right.
The one that's going to bring about the change is probably the few group in the society that's going to trigger and start the change, not the major populace.
No.
Because the major populace will just follow after the change has been done by this so-called small elite group, or maybe a small group of thinking citizens. All right. Now, if you look at this country, for instance, when you talk about good governance, don't you think that is a major issue? There's a major issue in terms of understanding what good governance is. For example, if we were to say in this country good governance, the issue arises, which kind of governance in the sense of, are we talking about democracy? Are we talking about democracy in the understanding of the Western democracy? I don't know why they call it Western. Or are we talking about a mixed democracy? Some other groups in this country will say, no, we want so-called Islamic government. You know what I'm saying? Eh?
Right.
So when there are so many competing ideological people within the so-called small influencing part of the society, how can we bring about even a simple thing about agreeing on what is good governance? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, correct.
So
correct.
what would your thoughts be then?
Because
I mean, this agent of so many conflicting views on what to change.
Yeah, so when we have conflicting views, so there is a kind of force and anti-force happening, and this will not bring about any good. So when these two forces are trying to create a change, then there will be another superior force which is trying to suppress it.
And how does the superior force come about? What determines that it's superior?
Okay, the superior force actually would belong largely to the people who hold the reins of the government,
Right.
who have the laws with them, who have the machinery with them. They will be playing the role of supporting some and not supporting some, right? Based on what they think is the right direction to go. Whether it should be more a religious ideology that should lead the governance of the country, or should it be a Western kind of a democracy, or should it be a democracy that would be based on solid principles of fairness, principle of honesty, right? Principle that the marginalized are taken care of, because democracy always talks about the majority, right? And you find that it is always the minority, and this minority may not be a minority. They could be in huge numbers, or we designate them as minority. If you take the example of, let's say, the rich and the poor dominate, although the control is in the hands of those who are rich. So the dominance, those who are in dominance, they tend to dictate a lot of things. So therefore, it is kind of important to then work on principles. Democracy is a concept. You can actually manipulate it in any way you want, actually, right? And because of a lot of manipulation, a lot of things have gone in the wrong direction. Change, it's supposed to happen in a particular way, it didn't happen. Because There are people who control those powers and bring about change in order to benefit themselves. Right?
So will I be right in saying that what you're essentially saying is you are proposing that instead of us being tied down to labels, Western ideas or Islamic ideas or Eastern ideas, you are saying let us look at the substance of the ideas being proposed.
That's right.
And let's try to identify in this country, for instance, what are the, if I may use the word, what are the universal principles to human nature that would work towards improving the collective happiness of the human beings. So if we're able to identify those universal principles which are essential, for example, I'm sure everyone would agree that transparency and accountability must be a universal principle.
That's right.
You know, if we even teach it to our children to be accountable for their behaviors.
That's right.
So if we transpose that into governance, then that becomes a universal principle as well.
That's right.
So you're proposing that if we, in our country, we get away from these labels of Islamic and non-Islamic, Western, non-Western, secular, etc., we look at the principles, then we're able to find common elements, common denominators among the citizenry, and we can work towards improving those principles towards achieving good governance. So you see that in that aspect we can change bad governance to good governance.
That's right.
Okay, now while I agree with you on that, the issue also remains this. Now when we agree that the universal principles are important, and you correctly pointed out that this is going to be done by the dominant group. Now would I be right in saying that when you talk about the dominant group, there are two kinds of dominance. One is dominance in terms of actual power, which will probably be those who are wealthy and those who have the political power.
That's right.
And the other is the dominance in terms of popularity.
That's right.
Because I think we all know, generally this is how it works in the political realm, that even though whether you're a king or whether you are the politician who's got a power, you still need the base,
That's right.
the popular people to step on them and to say, I have the popular support.
That's right.
So that is also equally frightening, isn't it? Is it not possible for the politicians or the leaders, who are instead of taking the right approach, they take the popular approach?
That's right. That's absolutely right. The issue is that the issue is basically that we need, as a human being, whether you're a politician or whether you're a king or a queen, the basic issue is that as a human being, you have to imbue yourself with solid principles of life. As you said, the universal principles of life. So eventually, when you become a politician, if you have principles of, let's say, fairness, justice, principle of honesty, accountability, right? Principle of compassion, right? Principle of being truthful, transparent. So these values are already in existence. Yes, it's already there in the sense that if you open up any religious scriptures, it's all there.
So you're saying that the leaders must have these preconditions first?
Correct. This value system must be imbued. If you want to create a major change in the society, you can only do that, let's say, from the family unit, and then moving up to the school unit, and then moving up to the tertiary levels, if you're looking at from the educational point of view. Since education is the fundamental right for everyone, so we have to start there.
Okay.
So if we can imbue that, for example, then hopefully when he or she becomes a politician, or he or she becomes a businessman, or he or she becomes a lecturer, or he or she becomes, let's say, even a lorry driver, that principle work through, and that will bring about great amount of change, because anybody with that principle want to make sure that those principles are put into practice, are alive, and it makes a society a better place to live in. Right? So that I'm looking at a very fundamental way of doing it. Okay. Because if you're going to get a group of very matured citizens and try to change them, it's not going to happen, because they have a baggage of their own values, which perhaps has got no roots to it, and they're colored by so many of their life experiences, and there's so much of pressure from so many corners, so they will just do what is most beneficial to the immediate and to their own, and the rest they have to be on their own.
Okay. See, you're talking about in the context of good governance and leadership.
That's right.
You're talking about it is important to ensure that the leaders themselves have the necessary fundamental values and the fundamental characteristics that we want.
That's right.
So, in order for the leaders to have that kind of fundamental values, that kind of fundamental characteristics, they must come from a society which has got that kind of a culture.
Exactly.
If the society itself does not have the culture of accountability,
Exactly.
doesn't have a culture of thinking culture, doesn't have a culture of respect for others, doesn't have a culture of inclusivity, and so on and so
Compassion,
forth,
yes.
compassion and so on and so forth. If that society does not have that kind of a culture, how is that society ever going to bring about the kind of leaders that we want? That's one problem that we
That's
have.
big problem.
Now, the
Yes.
second problem is, of course, any problem must start with discussion.
Correct.
Honestly, Prof, you're also in the education
That's right.
field. Do you ever see discussions and narratives on this kind of areas that they're thinking about, they're discussing?
Actually, if you look at the education system, uh, this, there is available a lot of room for such discussion.
But is it happening?
But fortunately, or rather unfortunately, because of the skew towards,
Now, is it?
yeah, currently, because of the skew towards the requirements in academia to achieve academic brownie points, as they say, like publications, because of the need to work on academic theories and so on. Sometimes these important issues are not really discussed. The social scientists do discuss about this, but
No, I'm talking about the dominant mainstream discussion.
The
I mean, today you have a lot of discussion on so many things, They're discussing the current political scenario.
yes,
They're discussing so many things like this, so many forums going on, etc., etc.
that's right.
But my feeling is, I don't know if there is, but I've not seen discussions addressing the fundamentals. I think
Yeah,
maybe
actually,
because it's not very sexy.
yeah. What's happening is that fundamentals, as you said, is not the very sexy thing to do.
Yeah.
So what the academics are doing is at a much higher level. So that level of discussion perhaps will not really reach down to the rest of the
general media
masses.
level?
Yeah, it will not, because some of the discussions are very much based on highly what you call research outcomes. Some of it are based on very complex models, behavior models. So when we have this discussion, even at the level of the society, they may not understand what is happening.
Yeah.
Because academia itself, the language that we use, right, the focus that we have to focus on is completely different from the fundamentals. So it is the fundamentals are not really the
So
mainstream
if
kind of.
If you're saying that academia is, the way you sound, as though you say that academia is far removed from what's happening on the ground. The academia is supposed to be the more intelligent thinking segment of the society. They're out all the thing that the academia is paid to think, because they have the luxury of time and so on and so forth. And you think for us, but based on what you are saying, probably it seems as though you're saying that academia is far removed from society itself. And if that is so, then who's going to think for society? You can't expect the politicians. They're so busy giving speeches, going around shaking hands. I'm not even sure they've got time to read and think. And the normal public, the citizens, they're very busy acting out a living, cari makan, cari kerja, jaga family. So they also have no time. So where and how then is this change of mindset to say, okay, look, we need to focus on the creation of fundamentals, principles within these future leaders. Where's it going to start then?
Actually, in the context of social science research, there are academicians who actually do research which has relationship with what's happening on the ground. Like, for instance, at one point in time, there was baby throwing, unwanted pregnancy, as they call it, and there was a research done on that. But a lot of this research, what happens is that it is presented in conferences, and a lot of these conferences are presentations where it is presented to the academics. So it is an academic to an academic, and then it gets published either in the form of in the form of a journal article, for example, or perhaps it's also published in the form of an abstract in the conference proceedings, right? And it stays there. So that some of the good research there doesn't filter downwards. So it stays there. It just stays there. It somehow doesn't filter downwards.
Then what then is the agent that can change society to a better state, to a better level?
So actually there is a mechanism, meaning to say that if of course academia, the research done in academic will have to follow certain research processes, which can be complex to the layperson or to the general masses. And when you get the outcome of the research, then that has to be diluted or has to be reinterpreted or has to be written in a way that the layman can understand, which will mean that there has got to be a good relationship between the media, who know how to tell the stories to the public.
However, when everything becomes politicized, then you find that the tentacles of politics permeates into every single sector of society, which is important sector of society. It permeates into the business sector, it permeates into the education sector, it permeates into the enforcement sector, and so on and so forth. Now, if you have this political octopus, you will call it, if this political octopus is a benevolent political octopus, it's an intelligent political octopus, it's a principled political octopus,
that's right,
then we are lucky. But if that octopus is also a product from this society which is non-thinking, a society which is very shallow thinking, which is more interested in giving speeches and so on and so forth, there will be a change. The change is from good to worse, to bad to even worse.
That's right.
So how do we then stop that, Prof?
Well, I mean,
you see my point, huh?
That's right.
Yeah.
Most of the politicians, I mean, they are all well educated.
Yeah.
They have a lot of knowledge,
Sure.
a lot of experience over the years. They understand a lot of things,
Right.
but unfortunately, as what you have said, is that they do a lot of good things. At the same time, there are a lot more things that they can do, right? And they tend to become selective based on what will firstly benefit them politically. So if there is academic research on, say, an applied research on some issues with the let's say urban poor as an example, they may not look at it because that could be a can of worms, so they'll try to avoid it. Of course, they will support you with funding and everything, so you can do your publication and present to one another. So in the end, I always used to say that a lot of the research that we do in social sciences particularly, we tend to present to one another and it stays in the journals. It doesn't filter down. And the best part is that it is funded. A lot of it is also funded from the government funding agencies.
Yes.
So, but the sad thing is they're not looking at it. So this selective approach by the people who are governing the country in taking what is important for them is problematic. If they can identify that, okay, this particular research outcome is important, and we need to work on that. Say a research on the fact that a lot of these rumah rakyat, it's like a pigeonhole actually, fit for perhaps the birds, but nothing is being done about it. Obviously, we have the funds and we have the ability to build larger spaces for these marginalized people. But as they say, who cares? But if you, as a politician, have the right values, you recognize that human life has to be improved. So that the change must happen in the living spaces of these so-called marginalized people. They're not marginalized, there are huge numbers out there, the poor. But we are not giving them that space.
Prof, you are now touching on this aspect of changing the income levels of people. You're looking at actually changing for instance, the fate of the B40s, for instance, and you took the example of the PPRT or the B40 housing.
Yeah.
All right. Now, for that kind of change to take place, on one hand, clearly you can see that there's an important element of uplifting the poor. And we all know there'll be so many discussions and all that. There are many ways of uplifting the poor, and one of them is giving them a fishing rod instead of a fish.
Yeah, okay.
I.e., that is by way of giving education and so on and so forth, and also giving the attitude and culture and all that.
Okay.
Now, having said all those kind of things, to answer you, possibly, isn't it possible that if we talk about, say, a better quality housing for the poor, it is not a question of whether or not we want to do it or we don't want to do it. The political being I'm talking about, it is a question of resource allocation.
Correct.
In the sense that we have X amount of budget, they prioritize and say that, look, we can only give so much to uplifting the poor living conditions, because the rest we need for other projects and so on and so forth. That is a priority being set. What I am saying is this: the priorities that the leaders set is also determined by not only their values in life,
That's right.
also the collective societal value. So we come back to again the question of, I mean, this may sound very simplistic. The question is, what about the other stakeholders in society, for instance? I mean, my worry is you find academics are doing research on PPRT and they say, look, they need to be assisted. And then you have a stakeholder, an NGO, for instance, trying to be a hero, and they say, look at the marginalized poor, we need to help. So everybody is barking on a problem without going back to the fundamentals of it, i.e., that problem only arose because the values in the society are bad.
That's right.
So going back to this education thing again, going back to this your children, my children,
That's
you know,
right.
and other people's children, what are we teaching them?
Yeah.
Where are they being taught? Because these are the people going to be, or are we going to be firefighters for the rest of our life?
That's right. Yes.
And the other point I like that you mentioned is the fact that, you see, ironically, these are funded by the government. Now imagine, why can it not be that certain research projects are simply funded by the government so that other necessary research projects need not be given? What I am saying is, if I come and give you a cup of coffee, the fact that I can give you a plate of rice becomes unnoticed.
That's right. Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So when we come back to, again, we want change, and we talk of good governance, right? There are many other areas of change in society that we require. Even the NGOs, for instance, or the so-called civil society, for instance. For that to be an agent of change, there need to be a collective thinking in society, isn't it?
That's right.
And what is your aspect? What is your thinking in terms of the role of NGOs, the role of civil society in bringing about change in society as well?
I think the role of civil society definitely is important. They carry the conscience. At least you have a group of people who are looking into the needs of the society which has not been addressed. And some of them do a really good job in handling specific areas, which simply also means that these NGOs have a certain degree of good value system, which sort of motivates them to establish that NGO and create the awareness, seek for help, push the politicians to look at that, allocate budget to address the problems. So they are playing a very important role in that sense. But as you pointed out earlier, whether it is governance, or whether it is housing, or whether it is public transportation system, whether it is affordance of scholarship, right, or allocation of scholarship, or allocation of funds for the poor, allocation of funds for development, right, grandiose versus normal development, right, it has to be grounded on a good value system. A good value system meaning that it must
values
be
and culture,
and it must benefit across the society, immaterial of what race or what religion. And this has to begin at the level of education.
Precisely.
And the funny thing about education is that right now, of course, at the tertiary level, we want them to achieve certain attributes.
Obviously.
But I think it's a bit too late at that point in time, right? If you want to achieve those attributes, those value systems, it's got to be done when in primary school. I remember some time ago, the former president of India, who visited Malaysia, when asked the question, what is most important in education, he said, focus on the primary kids, because that's when you can mold them in terms of a proper value system. So now that man actually is a man with solid universal values, who respects everything and anything. Now he was a great scientist from a very poor family, but because of his value system, he made it in a very difficult country like India. Malaysia is far ahead in terms of the resources endowed by the Creator. We got a lot of resources, but yet, you know, what we are lacking in is that principles of that value system, which should happen in education. What's happening in education is basically how many A's you're going to get.
Correct.
So why are we so focused on that?
Correct. And
you know, our forefathers who built this nation, they didn't get 10 A's or 20 A's.
Exactly.
So without that level of education, they were able to create harmony. They were able to win independence for the people, right? And they didn't get 10
respect
A's.
for everyone.
Exactly. There was
Inclusivity.
harmony, inclusivity.
And we progress also.
And we progressed. There was no skewness towards...
There was no greediness.
There was no religiosity skewness, nor income skewness.
Yeah.
So we were sort of at a nice playing field, as they say, right? Because of that value system they had. So they didn't have much education. They didn't even have a doctorate with them, but they were able to do it. Now we have got people who run the country having PhDs and doctorates, well educated from different parts of the world. But how come people are still saying that it's not enough, we need change, we are going down, we are a failed state?
I agree with you, Prof. And I particularly agree with you on the point that if we are truly caring about change and we want change, I would like to hear political leaders speak about wanting to change the current primary school system especially, and the secondary school, lower secondary school especially, the formative period. They change it in order to create citizenry, in order to create human beings first.
That's right.
In order to create values and so on and so forth, irrespective of religion and race. In fact, it is ironical that a religion should be divisive instead of inclusive.
That's right.
You know, so if we find that religion is divisive, then I will go on record, you as a Muslim, to say that the so-called, I'm not saying Islam, the religion, I'm not saying Islam, I believe, I'm saying the so-called kind of Islamization should stop in the schools. You know, if it is divisive.
That's right.
If it can be interpreted in the way the Quran interprets it and makes it inclusive, then it's a different story altogether. But so to summarize it, I would say that yes, they should start in the secondary school and the primary schools. In fact, personally, I remember my primary school, I was introduced to love for animals in my science garden project. I was in charge of rabbits and hamsters, and surprised that stayed with me for the rest of my life.
That's,
and if you remember, Prof, in primary school we have this autograph book.
that's right.
So I remember a teacher of mine wrote there, he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. You know, I only understood it I kept the book. I only understood it many years later in the university. When I looked at it, what it means is, he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. That means, number one, never give up.
That's right.
Number two, don't think that you've lost the battle now. You go back, you learn, you come back again.
Yes.
And you do not, you don't burn the bridges. And one more thing that really had a tremendous impact on me was in secondary school. We were in the same school together.
That's right.
And I can even see the wall which says, academic excellence is no substitute for poverty of character.
That's right.
So precisely what I'm saying, our obsession with A's and our obsession with these false achievements, which has been completely overturned by the COVID. In the sense that you no longer go for a 3-hour exam in the schools.
That's right, yeah.
It is completely essay writing and so on and so forth. So I hope that these kind of things, you know, not only our educationists, I hope that the leaders who are watching this will be speaking about these things in their election manifesto and so on and so forth.
The point about education...
And even the NGOs, I hope NGOs pick this up.
That's right. So even if you are an engineer, then you look at how best you can build structures that will benefit the society, not just in terms of the dollars and cents that you will be making at the end of the day. One more point, Dr. Jahaberdeen, I need to mention to you is that while we are looking at value systems, as we are looking at a solid change ahead of us, identifying what are the issues, and we need the value system, we must not forget to also identify what are the ills of the society, what are the ill values, the bad values that we have now in our very midst of society. Like we are very divisive. That's one bad habit that we have, right? We are perhaps too class conscious. We are perhaps too skewed towards our
wealth conscious as well.
well, yes. So all these ills of society also needs to be thought about, addressed in tandem with how do we replace that with a proper value system. It doesn't mean that if you are wealthy, you are a bad person. No. You're wealthy, it simply means that you work very hard, and a big portion or a certain portion of the wealth can go to
assisting the needy.
The needy and for the betterment
projects
of society. Don't forget the environment, as you said, the rabbits, the animal kingdom, as well as the flora and the fauna. That's all it means. Wealth was not, in my belief, wealth was, you made the wealth, but you may not also have made the wealth. Somebody else could have. But it so happened that you worked hard and you got it. You have to understand that it is, you need to be also in a way responsible in seeing some part of it go to the others rather than to amass for the next few generations. And what purpose is that?
I read what you're saying like this. You're saying that while we are in a quest, we have identified what are the good things that we want, and we want to change society into adapting and accepting those good things. You're saying that in order to do that, we must also be emboldened and honest to look at what are the ills, what are the bad things, what are the negative things that's stopping us, that is hampering us from progressing forward. Because if I understand you correctly, I think that's very in line as well with the Quran. I can't remember the verse exactly, where it says actually that you do not leave things in a vacuum. You replace the bad with the good, and then you progress. In order to replace the bad with the good, you must know where is the bad and replace it with the good. Now, to do that, that would mean we need to have behavior modification. And that behavior modification is, if you agree with me, is everything we really agree on that. That behavior modification must start with the kind of curriculum we have in the primary school, the kind of values that we instill, and the general culture that we have. What is the speeches that the leaders in our multiracial country are giving? They can't be giving one speech at Hari Raya, another speech at Chinese New Year, another speech at Diwali. They must speak in tandem. You know, they must have a constant, committed speech to everyone. So there are various elements and all that which require to have behavior modification. I think with that, you have anything to add?
Not for now, Dr. Jabbar.
Okay. So I think we have covered. Essentially, we are talking about the fundamentals being the values of society itself. And in order to achieve the change, we have to have the behavior modification as well.
That's right.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. T, for joining us. As always, it's a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Dr. Jabbar.
Right. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum to the viewers.